Committee will come to order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Roy.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Gentleman consider point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just missed 2 votes on the House floor because we were not given we did not recess on time. I think many of my colleagues are
That's not
probably
a properly stated point of order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
What is the intent of the chair in the future recesses to avoid the censorship of the voice of my constituents because I was not able to voice their views on important items on the agenda?
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Question of, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts for his 5 minutes. I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, may I just introduce, ask unanimous consent to introduce an article from NPR, June 8, 2021, discussing the film Medical Racism, where viewers are warned that in black communities something is very sinister. And the same thing that happened in the 1930s during the eugenics movement is happening again.
Without objection, will be entered in the record. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one of the saddest parts of this fabricated circus of outrage is the drumbeat of attacks that I have seen against the men and women of the Department of Justice and the FBI, many of them armed service veterans who in their earlier careers actually put on the uniform of this country and served honorably, as well as attacks against Department of Homeland Security, CDC, and Health and Human Services. And as evidenced today's hearing, the Republicans are continuing to go to great lengths to invoke wild and seemingly race-based conspiracy theories, misinformation, and propaganda to allege that those same men and women who at one point served our country in uniform are now somehow targeting the American people. Meanwhile, this same subcommittee on weaponization has turned completely a blind eye to the actual and well-documented blatant and egregious weaponization of the federal government undertaken by the previous president. We are, in fact, still receiving reports of actual weaponization committed by President Trump. In fact, we now have a recent sworn declaration from former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly indicating that President Trump suggested utilizing the IRS and other federal agencies to investigate his perceived enemies, who at the time happened to be 2 FBI agents who are examining his conduct. I ask for unanimous consent for this record, this sworn statement to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
We also have another recent disclosure from Miles Taylor, former Chief of Staff at the Department of Homeland Security, reporting that President Trump sought to wiretap the phones of his own White House aides in order to detect any leaks. To the great detriment of the American people, however, we are not investigating the actual weaponization of the federal government. And worse yet, this committee has come to embody weaponization itself, misusing congressional oversight to protect Donald Trump and attempt to divert attention from the multiple federal and state criminal investigations surrounding President Trump's misconduct in office. In the midst of the ongoing state prosecution in New York of President Trump, Chairman Jordan has repeatedly sought to interfere and influence that case, threatening to subpoena Mr. Bragg and even holding a field hearing on Mr. Bragg's prosecutorial record blocks from his lower Manhattan office, deliberately interfering in the rule of law being applied in that case. The Republican members of this committee have also followed the shameful example set by the former president in targeting the independent federal law enforcement personnel that have sought to hold Donald Trump accountable. These are the good and patriotic Americans trying to uphold the rule of law within the FBI and the Department of Justice. In the same vein as President Trump describing the Department of Justice and the FBI, my Republican colleagues have described these individuals as scoundrels, quote, vicious monsters. And the chairman of the other Republican members of this committee have continually described these agencies as, quote, corrupt, out of control, and rotten to the core. These are the men and women who are serving our country in the Department of Justice, trying to uphold the rule of law. Ms. Wiley, What is the underlying threat to American democracy and the rule of law to baselessly claim that the federal agency and the individual personnel at the Department of Justice and FBI are being weaponized to attack everyday Americans? What's the impact of that on our democracy? Your mic. Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, Congressman, there's more than one impact. One impact that's very clear and obvious, sadly, for far too many, is that foreign governments who have deep interest in sowing distrust in the American people against our own government and our own civil servants utilize that to generate and propagate mis and disinformation that then it puts out under disguise on social media platforms to help incite and spread the notion, seemingly in a way that suggests that it is not coming from a foreign government, so that it is sowing the seeds, not just of distrust, but fundamentally in any democratic country, it is critically important that we be able to have a relationship with our government and with law enforcement in order to make sure that people are coming forward to law enforcement, sharing information truthfully with law enforcement, and that law enforcement can engage in investigations into any version of potential crimes that have been committed in violation of our own laws without interference and without the refusal or inability to do so in a manner that also holds the privacy and protection of people's rights by also keeping that quiet, which is centrally important to criminal investigations.
Time of the gentleman from Massachusetts expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Yield to Mr. Roy.
Mr. Roy is recognized for 5
I
minutes.
thank the gentleman from Florida. I thank the chairman. Mr. Kennedy, first of all, your father served as the Attorney General of the United States. I'm a former Assistant United States Attorney. Do you believe that it is a proper function and role for Congress and for all of us to question whoever happens to be in the seat at the office of the Attorney General or in the FBI or in upper levels of government generally to seek the truth, wherever it may lead?
Make sure your mic's on.
Your microphone.
That is exactly the function that the United States Constitution assigned to the people of, to the members of Congress. And I would say this: I don't want President Trump misusing the FBI, and I don't want President Biden. I don't want anybody.
Amen. And I agree with that completely. Let me characterize my understanding of something and get your perspective on it. Following the 2016 election, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, Peter Marks met with you, to the best of my understanding, regarding vaccine safety, in part as a result of your engagement with President Trump. And at that meeting, you requested evidence of a vaccine undergoing placebo-controlled trial safety tests prior to licensing. After making a show of looking for the document, Dr. Fauci informed you, to the best of my understanding, that the document was back in Bethesda and that he would eventually send the document to you. The document, to the best of my knowledge, was never sent, and that you sued HHS for documents showing and trying to figure out the truth of the matter, and that you found that not one study was done on pre-licensing safety testing for COVID vaccines. After a year, HHS finally sent you a letter stating, we don't have any. This means, to the best of my understanding, that nobody knows the risk profiles for these products or whether they avert more harm than they cause. And as a result, there's no real science behind these statements, but rather guesswork. Is that a fair characterization of what you've experienced?
That is a fair characterization. We had looked for many years to find a pre-licensing safety trial of any of the 72 vaccines doses that are now essentially mandated. They're recommended, but that's effectively mandated for American children, and we have not been able to find any. And every other medication requires, prior to licensing by FDA, that the company perform a safety trial that compares health outcomes in a placebo group and a similarly situated vaccine group. My assumption was that was done for vaccines. We found out that it hadn't been, that it was not. They were exempt. And I made that statement publicly. Dr. Fauci contradicted me, and when President Trump ordered him to meet with me, him and and Francis Collins and a group of my colleagues. I said to them at that time, you've said publicly that I've been dishonest about that. Can you show us a single pre-licensing safety trial, placebo-controlled safety trial for any of the 72 vaccines required for American children? And he made that show of looking through a file, and he said, well, they're back in Bethesda. And I said, will you send them to me? And I never heard from him again, so we sued the HHS under the Freedom of Information Law. After a year of litigation, they sent us a letter which is posted on CHD's website that acknowledges that they are now not able to locate a single pre-licensing safety trial, placebo-controlled, for any of the vaccines that are now mandated for children. These are zero liability vaccines.
And so if I might interject in just limited time, and I hope you can expand on that further. I know my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, will probably expand on this later, but your uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, was a pretty strong opponent of sweeping immunity from liability for manufacturers of vaccines. And did he not introduce an amendment to repeal the so-called PrEP Act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, when he was a senator?
Yes, he did. And, you know, the immunity which was passed in 1986, neither the Republicans or Democrats wanted it. Ronald Reagan at that time, who signed the bill, said, and Wyeth was the company that was pushing it, and they were saying that they were losing $20 in downstream liabilities for every dollar that they made in profits from vaccines. They were going to get out of the business if they were not granted immunity. Ronald Reagan said to them at that time, why don't you make the vaccines safe? And Wyatt said, because they're unavoidably unsafe, which is true of most medicines. I'm not anti-vaccine, but I think we need to be honest and we need to have good science. That's all I've ever argued.
And closing out my time here, I would just say this. My father had polio. I understand the ravages of that disease. I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to have the polio vaccine, but I also want the truth being sought. I want to know the health impacts of the polio vaccine going forward and every other vaccine that's being administered. And I'll just close by saying and asking, I know that this is informed by a great deal of conversations you've had with mothers and moms who came up to you. And if you could expand on that, I'll yield back.
Yeah, I mean, I was dragged kicking and screaming into this space because I was confronted by, when I was touring the country on suing companies about mercury and fish. And by the way, people, I spent 30 years trying to get mercury out of the fish in this country, and nobody ever called me anti-fish. At that time, we were trying to get mercury out of vaccines because mothers were coming and saying, my child was injured by the vaccine. These were many, many hundreds, literally, of mothers with intellectual disabilities. And they said, nobody's listening to us. The Democrats aren't listening to us. The Republicans aren't listening to us. And I felt like I should listen to them and actually read the science. And that is what got me down into the...
Time.
And by the way, it's the worst career decision I have ever made.
Time of the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. You'll back.
Time of the gentleman inspired. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Plaskett. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian hate and violence skyrocketed as some racists blamed a virus coming out of China on all Asian Americans. Since March of 2020, Stop AAPI Hate, a nonprofit organization aimed at tracking and addressing anti-Asian hate, reported more than 11,000 anti-Asian acts of hate and violence. This same report found that 49% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced some form of discrimination. These acts of hate include Asian Americans being beaten, spit on, screamed at, and even killed. And the increases in these types of attacks during COVID accompanied a slew of anti-Chinese sentiments related to the virus, like calling it the quote-unquote China virus and even disgustingly quote-unquote Kung flu. Many Asian Americans were harassed, physically accosted, and told that they quote-unquote created the virus. Yet one of our Republican witnesses encourages this appalling rhetoric and promotes anti-Asian hate with dangerous and unfounded claims. Just last week, Mr. Kennedy suggested COVID-19 was a bioweapon and said it was, quote, targeted to attack Caucasians and black people, end quote, and that, quote, the people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese, end quote, suggesting that the Chinese people didn't suffer like others during the pandemic. Despite asserting that he should become their president, Mr. Kennedy seems to disregard the correlation between anti-Asian rhetoric and violence. Ms. Wiley, do you frequently work with minority communities, including Chinese American or other Asian American communities?
I do.
And do you think Mr. Kennedy's theory is racist?
I think that Mr. Kennedy's statements fuels the theories that suggest that there's a biology to race, and that therefore we can actually identify people in communities as possibly either being benefited by or being people who are not sharing the same interests and needs as the rest of us. And yes, that has served to drive hate and bias, and sadly, including violent incidents.
Now, it was said earlier in this hearing that Mr. Kennedy is a smart man. Now, so far as I know, he does not have any specific education or training in medicine. He is not an epidemiologist, one who studies infectious diseases. He has never conducted clinical trials in a professional setting. He has never done scientific research in a professional laboratory and published scientific findings in a peer-reviewed publication. Ms. Wiley, what kind of harm does someone with absolutely no medical training or knowledge do when they espouse unfounded anti-Asian vaccine theories during a fraught time like COVID?
One of the things that happened in this historic pandemic was that there was certainly a need to get on top of very quickly what the science said. I am not a scientist either. And so what social media platforms did was go and speak to government agencies because their own policies, their own user agreements required them to look at and figure out what the facts were so that they could assess what was responsible and what was not responsible to post. I say that because it was incredibly important to ensure that people were getting real-time information as possible, but also ones that really demonstrated what all of us need, rather than where and how we should ascribe blame, or where and how we should consider who benefits and who doesn't, because we were all harmed. But I say this in part because it was the social media platforms themselves that reached out to government agencies, including Health and Human Services and CDC, to get that information. And under the vacated opinion, it's really important to understand, it has been vacated by the Fifth Circuit, this preliminary injunction on all these incidents we're talking about, because one of the things it would do, in my view, just as in my legal view, is that it was actually saying that the government could not respond to such requests under this injunction, which is incredibly overbroad, dangerous, and doesn't allow government agencies to do what they are chartered to do.
Now, I'm an attorney by training, and one of the things I learned very early on in constitutional law is that no right given to the people of the United States is absolute, and that includes the right to free speech, because you do not have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater because it could produce harm and death of people by being false. These social media platforms have user policies to try to prevent that kind of harm. Is that not correct, Ms. Wiley?
That is correct.
And so we are not trying to censor speech. We are simply trying to create factually correct information to prevent harm to people, including death. And that's what they were trying to do during COVID. Is that not correct?
Legally speaking, absolutely. And I say that as a matter of law, which is that court cases say that the government has in fact, it's its role to ask for compliance with policies. The policies on the books of social media platforms were violated. And they
Excuse
said
me, Mr. Chairman, but the last questioner got an additional extra minute. I'm at 35 seconds over. I would
Point
just
of order,
ask that
Mr.
she
Chairman.
be
The
able to
Democrat beforehand got an extra
finish
minute.
her sentence.
Trying to be generous.
Finish her
Trying to be
sentence.
generous, even when the response is that the government determines the truth.
I
I'm trying
would
to be
like for
generous.
her to be able to finish her sentence, Mr. Chairman, then I will yield back.
Okay, Ms. Wiley, you can finish your sentence.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I remember the sentence, but
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
I just think the point was,
I do. You were saying the government should be the arbiter
Can
of
you
what's
please
true.
not put
That's
words into
actually-
the mouth of the witness and let her respond?
The chair
It's
now
her
recognizes the
answer.
gentlelady from New York, the gentlelady from California.
I love how you follow the rules, Mr. Chairman. It's really indicative of what a kangaroo court this is and what a
It's
circus it
censorship
is.
by the chair. It's censorship by the chair.
Oh, Lord.
Thank
Gentlelady
you,
from
Mr.
New York
Chairman.
is
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morris, isn't it true that your October 2020 Hunter Biden laptop from hell story has proven to be 100% factually accurate?
I was 27 when I published that story. It better have been.
Isn't it true that the FBI obtained Hunter Biden's laptop a full 10 months before your story broke?
That's correct, according to the subpoena that I published.
Isn't it also true that we now know that the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force coerced social media companies into an alleged forthcoming Russian, quote, hack and leak operation, and as a result, illegally censored the Hunter Biden laptop story? Isn't that true?
Yes.
And this forced censorship by government agencies like the FBI was paid for by the taxpayer, since the taxpayers fund the FBI. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, it has everything. It's a hellhole and cesspool of corruption and criminal conduct. It has hard drugs, prostitution, pornography, money laundering. It has Biden family shell companies, communist Chinese, corrupt foreign government deals for tens of millions of dollars in exchange for access to the Biden family. The Hunter Biden laptop from hell has all of this, correct?
Yeah.
And the American people are smart. They know that this was not a hack and dump. This was illegal government censorship to protect and prop up Joe Biden on the eve of the 2020 election. And according to polling, of people who were now made aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story, 53% would have changed their vote, including 61% of Democrats. So do you agree that the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story was determinative in the 2020 election, Ms. Morris?
Yeah, there are various polls that say that that there would have been a change in the outcome of the election, and obviously it's immediately relevant to a decision on who to vote for, so obviously.
And do you believe that this government censorship was election interference?
Yes. Any censorship of speech prevents your ability to think clearly. Yes, of course. Yes.
And Mr. Kennedy, I want to turn to you. You've heard me lay out this example of egregious and illegal government censorship. You have been censored yourself. Do you believe that government censorship is a form of election interference?
Yeah, I think democracy is dependent on the free flow of information. And if that information is distorted, if the public is lied to, then it interferes with election. And by the way, it interferes with public health. And the Wall Street Journal did an article a couple of weeks ago suggesting that the censorship of important health information cost American lives.
And Mr. Kennedy, I want to ask you specifically about the Hunter Biden laptop story. The total blackout on all social media outlets as well as telecom. You couldn't text the link to the Hunter Biden laptop story. This specifically was a form of election interference by the U.S. government in the 2020 election.
I don't know enough about it. I know that there was censorship on that story and other stories that, presumably could have changed people's minds about the election.
And we know the polling demonstrates that now. People have said they would have changed their vote had they been made aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story. Isn't that correct?
I am not aware of that, but I'm not surprised.
Mr. Sauer, I want to turn to you. I want your reflection on this form of government censorship, specifically in the 2020 election, as a form of election interference, and what I believe is some of the, most egregious political scandals that, I will live through in my lifetime. Mr. Sauer, what are your reflections?
I strongly agree with your characterization of that form of censorship as election interference. The evidence in our case strongly supports that. It strongly supports, and actually we have judicial findings now, that the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story was done at the instigation of federal officials in the FBI at a very high level of that organization. It was an orchestrated campaign of deception that was anticipatory. It was planned in advance, and it was, I think, consummated with the testimony that I hadn't seen before that's been put up today from Ms. Demlow, characterizing how, at the very end, the FBI then clammed up at the last minute after spending months of seeding the record in these endless, ceaseless meetings with social media platforms about there's a hack and dump coming, it's going to involve Hunter Biden. Then when it actually came, they said, well, no comment. Our judge focused on that particular issue as kind of the coup de grace in this form of election interference.
Thank you. My time's expired.